2 in the morning. St. Vincent's emergency room. Mara was changing an IV bag for a drunk patient when a wedding invitation slipped out of the man's coat pocket, and the groom's face on that invitation was her husband's face, the husband she had buried 3 years ago. Her hand still gripped the IV bag. Her feet were frozen to the floor, but inside her chest, the silver chain holding her dead husband's wedding ring suddenly felt heavy as lead, as if the dead man were pulling her down with him. This is the story of a woman who sold everything: her home, her health, even her sleep, to keep a promise alive, and a man who killed himself to bury that very promise. But there is a third person, someone neither of them knew existed, and this person lived by one rule only: never let a broken promise stay buried without someone paying the price. Watch until the end, because the way this story ends is not what you expect. If this story made you believe that the truth never dies, hit like and share it so more people can hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story, because the best one might be the one you haven't seen yet. 5 years earlier, the Amtrak station in Millbrook had been nothing more than a small waiting room beside the tracks, a place most of the town's residents never set foot in because they had no reason to leave. But that morning, Mara stood there with Wesley, and both of them believed this train would change their lives forever. Wesley had just been accepted into the MBA program at Wharton, the kind of school children who grew up in Millbrook only heard about on television and never dared imagine they could walk into. He stood in front of Mara, one hand holding an old suitcase, the other gripping her hand as though he were afraid that if he let go, the whole world would come crashing down. He told her this was only temporary, 2 years, 3 years at most. Then he would come back, not as some poor boy from a town that didn't even appear on the map, but as a man who could give her the life she deserved. Mara said nothing. She only looked at him, and in her gray eyes, already showing the first signs of weariness, there was a kind of light that belonged only to people who believed with their whole soul. Then Wesley did something Mara would later remember thousands of times, during the loneliest nights of her life. He slipped the silver wedding ring off his finger. The ring was so cheap that the plating had already begun to peel along the inner edge, but it was all they'd been able to afford on their wedding day. Wesley placed the ring in Mara's palm, closed her fingers around it, and told her to keep it. When he came back, he would replace this silver ring with a gold one, and she would never have to wear anything cheap again. Mara looked at the ring in her hand. She didn't think it was cheap. She'd never thought that. She took off the silver chain around her neck, the only necklace her mother had left her before she died, and slipped Wesley's ring onto it. When she fastened the clasp behind her neck again, the ring rested against the center of her chest, right where her heart was beating. The 2 people she loved most in the world now lay on the same chain, and she carried them with her every day. Wesley held her, not for long, because the announcement over the speaker had already called that the train was about to depart. He stepped onto the train stairs, turned back to look at her one more time, and gave her a smile Mara would remember forever. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was the last smile he ever gave her with his whole heart. The train began to move. Mara stood on the platform, both arms hanging at her sides, watching the cars slide past until all that remained was the red light at the back of the train, blinking in the morning fog. She stood there a little longer after the light had vanished completely, as though taking a step away would mean admitting that he had truly left her behind. Then she turned, walked toward the parking lot, climbed into her father's Ford F-150, and drove home to change clothes. That evening, she walked into the diner beside the highway and began the first shift in a stretch of days she didn't yet know would last for how long. But she was willing to endure it for as long as it took, because in her mind then, there was only one thought. Everything she did from that moment on was so Wesley could return exactly as he had promised. She didn't know that the promise had already begun to die the moment the train pulled away from the station. From the very first night she walked into the diner, Mara's life became a wheel that never stopped turning. By day, she worked as a nurse in the emergency room at St. Vincent Hospital, where she changed bandages, checked blood pressure, pushed stretchers, and ran from one hospital bed to another until her white shoes were damp with sweat inside. At 6 o'clock in the evening, she left the hospital, went back to her rented room for a quick shower, then drove her father's Ford F-150 to the diner beside the highway, where she carried trays of food and poured coffee for long-haul drivers until midnight. On weekends, instead of resting, she took delivery runs for the farm produce shops around town, stacking crates onto the truck bed, and driving down the dirt roads her father had traveled for decades before her in that very same vehicle. Every month, after paying rent, paying the electric bill, and buying just enough food not to faint in the middle of a shift, she sent Wesley $2,500. Sometimes that money was almost everything she had earned, and she had to eat instant noodles for 3 meals in a row to make up for it. But she never sent it late, never sent too little, and never complained in the messages that went with it. She wrote to Wesley that everything was fine, that she was still healthy, that he should feel at ease and focus on his studies. She didn't tell him there were mornings when she had to hit the alarm clock 4 times before she could force her eyes open because she'd slept only 4 hours the night before. She didn't tell him her feet swelled so badly that she had to soak them in ice water every night before bed. And she certainly didn't tell him that the diner owner had twice asked whether she needed a doctor's referral, because she looked as though she was losing weight far too quickly for someone barely past 25. But what exhausted Mara more than all 3 jobs put together was the thing she kept most carefully hidden. Wesley had told her during one phone call that when he came back, the 2 of them would move to New York City after he finished his time in Philadelphia, and she would need a better degree to work at a major hospital. He said it gently, as though he were helping her plan for the future, but Mara heard another meaning underneath. She understood that with the basic nursing degree she had earned from a community college in Pennsylvania, she wouldn't stand on equal ground with the world Wesley was entering. So, after finishing her diner shift each night, instead of going to sleep, she opened her old laptop and studied for an advanced nursing certificate online. She sat at the kitchen table in her rented room, eyes already heavy, fingers slowing on the keys, but she didn't allow herself to close the laptop until she had finished that day's lesson. She was trying to become another version of herself, a version Wesley wouldn't be ashamed to introduce to his colleagues, and she did it on a number of sleeping hours most people would have considered torture. Through all those late nights, there was only one thing that always lay beside the laptop on the kitchen table. It was the brown leather notebook her father had bought for her before he passed away. The notebook wasn't large, just the size of her hand, its leather cover worn at the corners because she carried it with her every day. This was the only place where Mara told herself the truth. In the notebook, she didn't write that everything was fine. She wrote that she was tired. She wrote that she missed Wesley so much her chest hurt. She wrote that sometimes she was afraid she would collapse before he had the chance to come home. But at the end of every page, she always added one line to remind herself that all of this would mean something when Wesley finished the program and returned to her. She believed that more than anything she had ever believed in her life, and it was that faith that kept her swollen feet moving forward every morning. She didn't know that every dollar she sent was building a new life for a man who no longer wanted to remember her name. Everything came apart at the beginning of Wesley's final year at Wharton. He called Mara on a Tuesday evening, his voice a little more urgent than usual, and said the program required a mandatory graduation project that needed real investment capital that he had tried every possible way but couldn't raise enough, and that he needed another $80,000. Mara sat on the bed in her rented room, the phone pressed to her ear, and she said nothing for nearly half a minute. Not because she doubted him, but because she was calculating in her head what she still had left to sell. Her savings had been sent away long ago. Her room was rented. The things in her home weren't worth even 1 week of Wharton tuition. And then she looked out the window, where the Ford F-150 was parked in the lot beneath the sickly yellow streetlight, the truck her father had driven for 20 years, hauling farm produce to make a living, the truck she was using for weekend delivery runs, the only thing left that still carried her father's breath in the driver's seat, where the leather had worn down in the shape of his back. Mara knew what she had to do. She couldn't sleep that night. The next morning, she drove to Scranton, a city more than an hour northeast of Millbrook. She found a man-people in the area called Cousin Joe Pellegrino, a middle-aged loan shark who lent money at 5% interest per month. Joe operated in territory controlled by the Ravelli family, and everyone knew borrowing money from Joe was easy, but repaying it was like trying to swim against a waterfall. Mara sat across from Joe in a small office behind a laundromat. She placed the deeds to her father's small house on the desk. Joe looked at her, looked at the papers, then looked back at her. He asked only one question. Was she sure? Mara nodded. She couldn't speak because her throat had closed up. Her hand trembled as she signed the paper, and she had to press her left hand over her right to keep the writing from drifting outside the line. Joe took the truck keys. Mara walked out of the laundromat on her own 2 feet, and from that day on, she walked 4 kilometers to the hospital every morning. She lost the truck, lost the income from her weekend deliveries, but she sent the entire $80,000 to Wesley without keeping back a single dollar for herself. 3 weeks later, Wesley made a video call. This time, he wasn't frantic. He sat in front of the camera, wearing a white shirt, his hair neatly combed, with the widest smile Mara had seen since that day at the train station. He said the project was finished, that he was about to graduate, that everything Mara had done hadn't been wasted. Then he looked straight into the camera, lowered his voice, and said the two words Mara had been waiting for nearly 3 years to hear. He was coming home, Mara cried. Not from sadness. She cried because, for the first time in nearly 3 years, she felt as though she was about to breathe normally again. She asked him when, which flight, which day. Wesley smiled and told her to wait a few more weeks, that he was arranging everything, and then he would give her the exact details. He said he loved her. He said he missed her. He said every sacrifice she had made would be repaid 100-fold. Mara believed every word. She hung up, lay down on the bed, hugged the pillow to her chest, and smiled until she drifted off to sleep. That was the last night she slept well. 2 days later, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Mara's phone rang. She reached for it in the dark, eyes still closed, thinking the hospital was calling her in for an emergency shift. But the voice on the other end wasn't a coworker. It was the voice of a man she had never heard before, identifying himself as a Pennsylvania state trooper. And he said the words, "No one is ever ready to hear at 4 o'clock in the morning." There had been an accident on Route 6. The car was registered under Wesley Carter's name. The wreckage was charred beyond recognition. Mara didn't remember what she answered. She only remembered the phone slipping from her hand and falling to the floor, and herself sitting there in the darkness, one hand clutching the silver chain on her chest, where Wesley's wedding ring still rested between 2 beats of her heart. The police told Mara that a Honda Civic had crashed into the median on Route 6 in northern Pennsylvania at around 2 o'clock in the morning. The car had gone up in flames completely before the fire crew could arrive. Inside the vehicle, they found a wallet containing identification papers, a driver's license, and a cell phone, all registered under the name Wesley Carter. The scene was unrecognizable. The state police worked with the medical examiner's office, compared the dental records stored in the system, and the results showed a partial match. The official conclusion was issued 3 days later. Wesley Carter, 30 years old, a resident of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, had died in a traffic accident. There was no suspicion, no further investigation. The file was closed. But behind that neat conclusion was a performance staged with a cold calculation Mara could never have imagined. Wesley hadn't been driving that car. He hadn't been on Route 6 that night. Weeks earlier, he had contacted an employee at the life insurance company where Mara had bought a policy for him before he left for New York. In exchange for a promised share of the insurance payout, that person helped Wesley alter the dental records in the system so that when the medical examiner's office made the comparison, the result would match whoever was sitting in that burned car. The Civic had been bought with cash from a junkyard. The papers in the car were real. The driver was a drifter no one would ever come looking for. And Wesley Carter, on paper, officially ceased to exist. Mara received the urn of ashes on a Thursday afternoon. She held it with both hands, and she remembered that it was lighter than she had expected. She had imagined the ashes of a grown man would weigh more than that. But she pushed the thought away because she didn't want to think anything more about that night on Route 6. The funeral was held at the small church in Millbrook that weekend. Not many people came. Wesley had no family, and neither did Mara. A few co-workers from the hospital stopped by to lay flowers and then left. The diner owner brought a plate of pastries that no one touched. The pastor read a short passage from Scripture, said a few familiar words of comfort he had probably spoken at hundreds of other funerals before, and then everyone left one by one. In the end, only Mara remained, standing alone before the small altar, where the urn sat between 2 candles. She didn't cry, not because she was strong, but because she had cried herself empty during the 4 days before, and now her body had nothing left to give. She only stood there, one hand resting on the urn, the other clutching the silver chain on her chest, and she whispered to Wesley that she was sorry she hadn't been beside him that night. She apologized to a man who had arranged everything with his own hands, so she would have to stand in that very place, weeping before an urn of ashes that contained no one she knew, and she had no idea at all. A week after the funeral, when Mara had just walked back to her rented room after an afternoon shift, she saw a man leaning against the fence in front of her door, Cousin Joe Pellegrino. He didn't greet her, didn't offer condolences, didn't ask how she was. He only said that dead men didn't repay debts, but debts didn't die with the dead. She had handed over every cent of the $50,000 insurance payout to him, but the remaining $30,000 in principal still loomed over her, as her monthly payments barely covered the suffocating interest. Mara stood in front of the door to her rented room, still holding her key, looked straight into Joe's face, and didn't say a word. She didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't explain that she had just buried her husband, that she no longer had a truck, no longer had money, no longer had anything except her thin body and 3 jobs that had now become only 2, because she had no vehicle left for deliveries. She simply nodded once, stepped inside, and closed the door. Then she sat down on the kitchen floor, her back against the refrigerator, and hugged the leather-bound notebook to her chest. She sat that way until the sky had gone completely dark, without turning on the light. While Mara sat on the cold kitchen floor holding her father's notebook, more than 100 kilometers east of her, in a hotel in Newark, New Jersey, Wesley was standing before a mirror, shaving his face clean, combing his hair into a new style, and on the bedside table lay a complete set of documents under the name Weston Cartwright. 3 years passed, and Mara lived through each day like a person walking through a tunnel without knowing whether there was any light at the end. She lost 7 kilograms. Her collarbones rose sharply beneath her white blouse every time she bent over to change the sheets on a hospital bed. Without the Ford F-150, she woke at 4:30 in the morning to catch the first bus to the hospital, and on the days when the bus was late, she walked. The night shifts at the diner continued, but now she had to walk the whole way home after 12 o'clock at night because the last bus route stopped running at 11 o'clock. Every month, she set aside part of her wages to pay Cousin Joe little by little, and every month, the 5% interest kept the principal almost frozen in place, even though she'd been paying steadily. She completed her advanced nursing certificate in the 14th month after the funeral. The night she received her passing result by email, she sat in front of the laptop, looked at the congratulations on the screen, and felt nothing at all. She had studied for this degree because Wesley told her she needed it, but Wesley lay inside the urn on the bookshelf, and there was no one left for her to prove that she had tried hard enough. To pay off the debt faster, she had taken on extra overnight graveyard shifts at the hospital. That was how she found herself in the emergency room at 2 o'clock in the morning. A drunk patient was brought in on a stretcher, the smell of alcohol thick throughout the room, his eyes squeezed shut, his mouth mumbling words no one could understand. Mara followed the procedure exactly as she had done hundreds of times before, checked his pulse, took his blood pressure, hung the IV bag. When she slipped her hand into the patient's coat pocket to retrieve his identification, as required, a stiff card fell out, sliding to the floor, printed side facing up. Mara bent down to pick it up, and her world stopped. The wedding invitation was printed on heavy cream paper, its letters embossed in bronze gold, saying that Weston Cartwright and Celeste Halloran cordially invited guests to attend their wedding that fall in the Hamptons. Beneath the words was a photograph of the couple. The woman was someone Mara didn't know, with ash blonde hair and a soft smile of the kind that belonged to people born already accustomed to standing before cameras. But the man, she knew him better than anyone else in the world. That slightly square jaw, those eyes that narrowed a little when he smiled, and the small indentation on the bridge of his nose that she had touched with her fingertips hundreds of nights before falling asleep. It was Wesley. Mara was still holding the IV bag, but her fingers tightened around it until they went white. She stood in the middle of the emergency room, her feet nailed to the floor, her eyes fixed on the invitation, and inside her chest, everything she had buried for 3 years suddenly surged back all at once. Not the grief of losing a husband, something far worse. The realization that perhaps she had never lost him, because perhaps he had chosen to disappear. She set the IV bag down on the stand, stepped into the hallway, leaned her back against the wall, and breathed through her mouth like someone drowning on dry land. Another nurse ran over and asked whether she was all right. Mara shook her head, said she was just a little dizzy, then slipped the invitation into the pocket of her blouse and returned to the emergency room. She finished the rest of that night's shift like a machine. She changed IV fluids on time, recorded patient files to standard, and answered the attending doctor in her usual voice. No one realized that inside the woman moving between those hospital beds, something had just broken open, and she didn't yet know what to call it. At 6 o'clock in the morning, she left the hospital. When she got back to her rented room, she didn't change clothes, didn't shower, didn't eat. She sat down at the kitchen table, pulled the invitation from her pocket, placed it in front of her, and looked at the man's face in the photograph one more time to make sure she hadn't seen wrong. She hadn't. Then she reached for the leather-bound notebook, opened it to the next blank page, and wrote only 3 words. He is alive. Mara didn't sleep another minute after writing those 3 words in the notebook. She sat at the kitchen table until morning, looking at the wedding invitation, then at Wesley's death certificate, which she had kept in the drawer of her bedside table for the past 2 years. 2 pieces of paper. One said he was dead. The other showed his face printed beside another woman, along with the words inviting guests to a wedding. Both of them couldn't be true, and Mara knew she wouldn't find the answer by sitting in her rented room in Millbrook. She packed her backpack that very morning. The leather-bound notebook, the wedding invitation, the marriage certificate, and the death certificate. She locked the door to her rented room, walked to the bus station, and bought a Greyhound ticket to New York. The ride took nearly 4 hours, and for all 4 of those hours, Mara sat in the last row, her backpack hugged against her chest, her eyes staring out the window without seeing anything at all. She didn't have a clear plan. She only knew she needed to go to the place where that wedding invitation had come from, and she needed someone to look her in the face and tell her the truth. The first thing she did when she arrived in New York was go to the police department. She walked into the nearest precinct in Manhattan and waited nearly an hour before she was allowed to speak with the officer on duty. She placed the death certificate and the wedding invitation on the desk, then said her husband had died 3 years earlier in an accident on Route 6 in Pennsylvania, but she had just seen his face on a wedding invitation for a man named Weston Cartwright. The officer looked at her, looked at the death certificate, looked at the wedding invitation, then typed Wesley Carter's name into the system. The file appeared. Wesley Carter, 30 years old, deceased in a traffic accident. Case closed. No suspicion. The officer then typed in the name Weston Cartwright. The file appeared. Weston Cartwright, 33 years old, born in Boston. No criminal record. Currently vice president at Halloran Capital Group. 2 men with different names, different places of birth, and entirely different backgrounds. The officer looked at Mara with a gaze she would never forget. It was the look of someone trying to be polite to a person they believed wasn't quite sane. He said that according to the system, these were 2 completely different people. The death certificate was valid. The identity records were valid. The fact that 2 men looked alike wasn't grounds to open an investigation. He advised her to go home and rest, and added that if she continued going to government offices to present this matter, he would have to file a report for harassment. Mara took back her documents, slipped them into her backpack, and walked out of the police station. She stood on the Manhattan sidewalk, among the stream of people passing by who had no idea who she was, and she felt as though she had just been slapped with the very truth she was holding in her hands. She was right, but no one believed her. She had evidence, but her evidence was a wedding invitation and the memory of a widowed wife, and that meant nothing inside the system. But Mara didn't stop. She took the subway to Madison Avenue, where the Halloran Capitol building rose in glass and steel, so tall she had to tilt her neck back to see the top. She walked into the lobby, went to the reception desk, and said she needed to meet an employee named Wesley Carter. The security guard typed the name into the computer, then shook his head. No one named Wesley Carter worked there. Mara took out the wedding invitation, pointed to the photograph of the man, and said this man was her husband, that he was using a false name, and that she had the marriage certificate right there. The security guard looked at her with the same kind of gaze the police officer had given her earlier, then picked up the phone and called the building manager down. A man in a black suit came out, looked over Mara's papers, looked at the invitation, then said curtly that the man in the photograph was Mr. Weston Cartwright, vice president of strategy, and that he wasn't Wesley Carter. He added that if Mara didn't leave the building within 5 minutes, security would call the police. Mara stepped out of the Halloran Capitol building at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. She stood on the Madison Avenue sidewalk, her backpack on her shoulder, her old coat caught between the suits and office dresses sweeping past on either side, and she understood something she had never had to face before in her life. She was right. She knew she was right. But being right meant nothing if no one was willing to listen. The police didn't believe her. The company didn't believe her. The system she had always thought would protect honest people had turned its back on her twice in a single day, and she stood there, in the middle of a city of more than 8 million people, without even one person to tell her she wasn't crazy. Mara walked aimlessly after leaving the Halloran building. Her feet kept moving, but her head was empty, as though her body were traveling on instinct, while her mind had already shut down. She didn't know how long she had walked, or how many streets she had crossed. She only knew that when she finally stopped, she was standing beside Bryant Park, where the green rows of trees and long stone benches looked as though they belonged to another world entirely from the one she had just been pushed out of. She sat down on a stone bench, set her backpack on her lap, and closed her eyes for a few seconds. When she opened them, a man was standing in front of her. Cousin Joe Pellegrino. Mara hadn't even had time to understand why Joe was in New York before he spoke. Joe said he knew she had come up here. He had followed her from Millbrook, because when a debtor suddenly left town without warning, that was the sign of someone planning to run. Mara wanted to say she wasn't running, but Joe didn't give her the chance. He grabbed her wrist, pulled her up from the bench, and shoved her into the narrow alley right beside the park, where no one was passing through. Joe stood close to her face and said she still owed $30,000 in principal plus interest, that he had been patient long enough, and that she had 48 hours to bring him the money, or he would have to use other ways to collect. Mara stood against the brick wall, her wrist aching from his grip, but she didn't scream, and she didn't cry. She was too tired to be afraid. Then came the sound of an engine. A black Mercedes stopped at the mouth of the alley, quiet as though it had been parked there all along instead of just arriving. The rear door opened. A man stepped out. Salvatore was nearly 60, wearing a gray suit, his silver hair combed back, his stride slow, yet each step was solid in the way of a man who never needed to hurry. He said nothing. He simply stood at the entrance of the alley and looked at Joe. That was all. Joe turned his head, and the moment his eyes met the older man, the hand gripping Mara's wrist let go as if it had touched fire. Joe backed away one step, then two, mumbling something Mara couldn't hear clearly, but it sounded like the apology of a man who had just realized he had gone too far on territory that wasn't his. Joe lowered his head, avoided looking at the man, then turned and hurried out through the other end of the alley and disappeared. The Italian man came closer to Mara. He took a white business card from the inside pocket of his jacket, with no name, no title, only a string of phone numbers printed in black ink. He handed it to Mara and said, in English touched by a faint Sicilian accent, that his boss wanted to speak with her. Not now. Whenever she was ready. Mara looked at the business card, then at the man. She asked who his boss was. He didn't answer. He only added that she didn't need to worry about Joe anymore, then turned and walked back to the Mercedes, got in, and the car rolled away without a horn, without a sound. Mara stood alone in the alley, holding the white business card, and she didn't understand what had just happened. She slipped the card into her coat pocket beside the crumpled wedding invitation and walked out of the alley. At the same time, in an old warehouse in Red Hook, Brooklyn, Cousin Joe Pellegrino was sitting on an iron chair across from a man he didn't dare look straight in the face. Dante Ravelli sat on a wooden chair on the other side of the table, one leg crossed over the other, both hands resting on the armrests, and on the table in front of him lay a thick white envelope. Dante told Joe he would say this only once. Remove Mara Whitfield's name from the debt book. Take this envelope as payment in full, principal and interest. Leave Pennsylvania. And if Dante heard Joe's name one more time, then next time it wouldn't be an envelope placed on this table. Joe looked at the envelope, looked at Dante, then looked at Salvatore Bruno standing, with his arms crossed by the door. He didn't ask another question. He took the envelope, stood, lowered his head, and walked out of the warehouse. 10 minutes later, Sal called Dante. He reported that the girl had refused to meet, that she had put the business card in her pocket but hadn't said she would call. Dante was silent for a moment on the other end of the line. Then he said it was all right. She would call. Mara bought a Greyhound ticket back to Pennsylvania that evening. She sat in the Port Authority bus terminal, her backpack on her lap, the ticket held in her hand, and decided that everything ended here. She had tried. She had taken the documents to the police, and they had called her a madwoman. She had gone all the way to the building where Wesley worked, and they had thrown her out as if they were chasing away a vagrant. She had been grabbed by the wrist in a New York alley by the very loan shark she had borrowed money from for Wesley, and she had been given a business card by a strange man, not knowing where it led or what it led to. She was tired. If Wesley wanted to be dead, then he had been dead to her for a long time. She didn't need to dig up a grave to prove there was no one inside. She would go back to Millbrook, pay off the rest of the debt somehow, work until her body no longer allowed it, and live the rest of her life with the 3 words written in her notebook, without ever telling anyone. She opened the leather-bound notebook. She meant to write one final line, and then close it forever. But as she turned to find a blank page, The pages flipped backward, and the notebook opened to the very first page. The page she hadn't reread in years because she knew it was there and didn't need to look. But tonight, beneath the fluorescent lights of the Port Authority bus terminal, the words on that first page appeared before her eyes in the slightly trembling blue ballpoint handwriting of a man who had written them years earlier, on the day she graduated from nursing school. Her father had written, "Mara, don't ever let anyone steal your name." Mara looked at that line. She looked for a long time, so long that someone sitting beside her asked if she had missed her bus. She didn't answer. She read the line one more time. Then she thought about everything that had happened. Wesley hadn't only abandoned her. He had erased himself so she wouldn't be able to find him. He had taken her money, her health, her father's truck, her 2 years of mourning, and even his own name, so she would have nothing left to hold on to in order to demand the truth back. He had stolen his own name, and by doing that, he had stolen hers too, because Mara Whitfield, on paper, was the widow of a man who didn't exist. She looked down at the Greyhound ticket in her right hand, then at her father's words in the notebook in her left. She tore the ticket in half. Then she tore it into 4 pieces. She slipped the pieces into her coat pocket, closed the notebook, and reached into the other pocket of her coat. The white business card was still there, with the phone number printed in black ink. Mara stood, slung the backpack over her shoulder, walked out of the Port Authority bus terminal, and called. 3 days before, Sal Bruno stood in the alley beside Bryant Park and made Cousin Joe let go of Mara with nothing but a look. Everything had begun, with an ordinary meeting Sal held every quarter. The Ravelli family controlled most of the underground business across northeastern Pennsylvania, from Scranton down to Wilkes-Barre, and every quarter, Sal made a circuit to collect protection fees from those operating on that territory. Cousin Joe Pellegrino was one of them. Joe was a loan shark, and in return, he paid a regular fee so he could conduct his business in peace without anyone interfering. But this quarter, Joe didn't have the money to pay on time. When Sal sat across from Joe in the small office behind the laundromat in Scranton, Joe began asking for an extension. He said collecting debts had been difficult in recent months, that many debtors had run off, that the economy was bad. Sal wasn't a man who enjoyed listening to excuses. He demanded that Joe provide his current debtor list to prove that he was truly struggling and not hiding money. Joe reluctantly opened his book and read out each name. Most of them were names Sal didn't care about, until Joe reached one line. Mara Whitfield, $80,000 in principal plus interest, wife of Wesley Carter, deceased. Sal showed no reaction outwardly, but inside his head, the name Wesley Carter rang like a familiar bell he couldn't immediately remember hearing before. He ended the meeting with Joe, got into the car, and on the drive back to New York, he called an assistant at the Ravelli Holdings office and asked them to pull the current list of the corporation's business partners. Ravelli Holdings was working with Halloran Capital Group on a major real estate project in Jersey City, and on the list of Halloran executives, there was a name Sal had read many times in contract documents: Weston Cartwright, Vice President of Strategy. Sal drove straight back to the office, opened the personnel file Halloran had sent along with the partnership agreement, and looked at Weston Cartwright's profile photograph. Then he searched public records for a copy of Wesley Carter's death certificate. He placed the 2 photographs side by side on the desk. The same face, the same slightly square jaw, the same faintly narrowed eyes, the same small indentation on the bridge of the nose. The next morning, Sal brought those 2 photographs into Dante Ravelli's office. He didn't say much. He simply placed the 2 photographs on the desk, one side showing a copy of the death certificate, stating that Wesley Carter had died 3 years earlier, the other showing the profile photograph of Weston Cartwright, now the vice president of the largest business partner Ravelli Holdings was working with. He said that the wife of the dead man owed Joe Pellegrino $80,000, and the dead man was sitting in an office on Madison Avenue under a new name. Dante looked at the 2 photographs. He said nothing for nearly a minute. Then he looked down at his left wrist, where the antique Patek Philippe watch lay silent against his skin. The watch wasn't his. It had belonged to his mother, Constanza Ravelli, the Sicilian immigrant woman who had worked as a seamstress 14 hours a day to put his father through school. His father had left many years earlier, following the daughter of a federal judge, and had never come back. Constanza died alone in a rented apartment in the Bronx. No one knew for 3 days, until Dante opened the door and found her lying on the kitchen floor, her hand still clutching this watch. He had worn it since that day. 12 years. Not once had it left his wrist. Dante looked back at the two photographs on the desk. A woman was paying a debt for a man who had abandoned her by burying himself alive. He had seen this story before. He had lived inside the consequences of this story his entire life. He said 2 words to Sal. "Find her." Sal picked Mara up in the black Mercedes at a street corner 2 blocks from the Port Authority bus terminal. He didn't say much on the way, only telling her they were going somewhere to talk, not somewhere to worry. The car stopped in front of an old Italian restaurant on Mulberry Street, the kind of restaurant passers-by would think had been closed for years because the sign was faded and the curtains were drawn shut. Sal opened the door for her, and Mara stepped into an empty dining room, with no customers, no music, only the smell of tomato sauce and toasted bread mingling in the air. A man was sitting at the table at the far end of the room, facing an empty chair. That was the first time Mara saw Dante Ravelli. He didn't stand when she arrived. He didn't shake her hand, didn't introduce his name, didn't give her a polite smile. He only looked at her with cold blue-gray eyes, gestured for her to sit in the chair across from him, then pushed a brown folder across the table. Mara opened the folder. The first page was Weston Cartwright's profile photograph from Halloran Capital's internal personnel page. The same picture she had seen on the wedding invitation, but now printed more clearly, more sharply, and Wesley's face in it was no longer a suspicion but an obvious truth. The second page was Weston Cartwright's personnel record. Born in Boston, orphaned, self-funded scholarship, no family. The third page was a copy of the contract between Wesley and a dentist in New Jersey, clearly recording the payment made to alter dental records in the federal system. The fourth page was a receipt from the life insurance company, confirming a $50,000 payout to Mara Whitfield as the sole beneficiary of Wesley Carter's insurance policy. The final page was a photograph from the newspaper. Weston Cartwright and Celeste Halloran at the Halloran family's charity gala, with a caption underneath, stating that the couple had been engaged for 14 months, and that the wedding was expected to take place in the fall. Mara turned each page. Her hands didn't shake. She had passed the stage where fear could make her hands tremble. What she felt now wasn't fear, and it wasn't anger, but a cold clarity, as though the fog she had been living inside for 3 years had just been torn open, and she could see everything behind it exactly as it was. She closed the folder, looked straight into Dante's eyes, and asked what he wanted from her. Dante sat still for a while. Then he said he didn't want anything. He only needed her to stand upright when the truth was spoken. The rest was his work. Mara didn't look away. She asked again why he was doing this. He didn't owe her anything. He didn't know her. Why? Dante turned the gold signet ring on the ring finger of his right hand, slowly, as though it were a habit he had whenever he was deciding how much to say. Then he said it was because someone had once lost the very thing she was searching for, and he didn't want that to happen again. He didn't explain further. He didn't say who that person was, but the way he said it, with his voice dropping half a tone on the final word, told Mara this wasn't the empty speech of a man playing at power. This was the voice of someone carrying an old wound. After the conversation, Mara didn't leave right away. She climbed the staircase behind the restaurant, leading up to a small rooftop overlooking Mulberry Street. She needed air. She stood there for a few minutes, before she heard footsteps behind her. Dante stood a few steps away, both hands in the pockets of his coat, saying nothing. Mara didn't turn to look at him. She looked down at the street and asked whether his mother had been angry with his father. Dante was silent for quite a long time before answering. He said no. She hadn't been angry with his father. She had been angry with herself, for loving the right man and believing the wrong words. Mara looked down at her own hands, thin hands marked with calluses from 3 years of working 3 jobs, and said quietly that she was the same. Dante stood still, his eyes facing forward, then said that she was different from his mother in one way. She was still standing here. No one said anything more after that. The two of them stood on the rooftop of an old Italian restaurant in Little Italy, a few steps apart, and there was nothing romantic between them. Only 2 wounds shaped the same way, caused by 2 different men, but in the same manner, leaving after taking everything a woman was able to give. While Mara stood on the rooftop of Antonelli's, 10 blocks away, the man she had buried was sleeping in an apartment in Soho. Weston Cartwright, 33 years old, vice president of strategy at Halloran Capital Group, engaged to Celeste Halloran, the only daughter of Arthur Halloran, one of the most powerful men on Wall Street. That was the version the world knew. But 3 years earlier, this man hadn't existed. 3 years earlier, he had been Wesley Carter, an MBA student at Wharton living on the money his wife sent from Millbrook, Pennsylvania. He was intelligent. No one could deny that. Wesley had always been intelligent, and it was that intelligence that made him dangerous, because he was skilled enough to see opportunities most people overlooked, yet cold enough to seize them without looking back. When he entered Wharton, he entered a world where his poor past in Millbrook became an obstacle instead of a source of motivation. The people around him talked about family, about connections, about networks, and Wesley quickly understood that here, being good wasn't enough. You needed the right background, and his background was a town that didn't exist on the map, a wife who worked night shifts as a nurse, and a mountain of debt that his own wife was carrying so he could sit in a lecture hall. Wesley wasn't ashamed of Mara. He was ashamed of himself, of the old version of himself, and little by little, he began to believe that the only way to become the man he wanted to be was to erase the man he had once been. The decision to stage his disappearance didn't come in a single night. It came slowly. From every time he avoided mentioning Mara to his friends. From every time he said he had no family when someone asked. From every time he looked in the mirror and saw that this face could belong to anyone, as long as it wasn't Wesley Carter from Millbrook. When he arrived in New York with a new name, new records, and a new story, he applied to Halloran Capital with real talent of his own. He was good at finance, good at strategy, and better than anything else at making people believe the story he told. The story of Weston Cartwright, the orphan boy from Boston, with no family, no foundation, who had built everything with his own hands from nothing. Arthur Halloran heard that story, and saw in Weston the image of a man he wanted as a son-in-law. Celeste Halloran heard that story and loved Weston because she believed he was living proof that willpower could overcome circumstance. She met him at a charity fundraiser she had organized for the Family Foundation, and he spoke to her with the calculated humility that only truly gifted performers can sustain over time. They became engaged after 14 months of dating. But behind everything the world saw, Wesley wasn't happy. He was successful, but he wasn't at peace. Every night before sleep, he checked his phone, not because he missed anyone, but because he was afraid. Afraid of a message from someone in Millbrook, afraid that an old photograph might suddenly appear on social media, afraid that a colleague at Halloran might take a business trip to Pennsylvania and happen to hear the name Wesley Carter. He lived each day like a fugitive even though no one was chasing him, and that fear corroded him from the inside in a way no one could see from the outside. He had built his new life on the foundation of a fake death, and every floor he added only made that foundation shake harder. But he didn't stop, because stopping would mean admitting that everything he had sacrificed, everything he had destroyed, had been meaningless. And Wesley Carter, or Weston Cartwright, or whatever name he chose to use, was the kind of man who would rather keep building on cracked ground than admit he had been wrong from the moment he laid the first brick. Dante Ravelli walked into the Halloran Capitol building on Madison Avenue at 10 o'clock on Monday morning, without an appointment, without advance notice, and with no one beside him except Sal waiting in the car outside. He went straight through the lobby, past the reception desk, into the elevator, and up to the floor where Weston Cartwright had his office. The secretary sitting outside Weston's office looked up when she saw Dante approaching, and she recognized him at once. Not because she knew who he truly was, but because Ravelli Holdings was one of Halloran Capital's largest investment partners, and Dante Ravelli's face was on the list of people reception had been instructed never to stop. The secretary asked whether he wanted her to announce him first. Dante shook his head, set his hand on the doorknob, and walked in. Wesley was sitting behind his desk. He looked up when the door opened, and his face shifted from surprise to politeness in less than a second, the reflex of a man used to receiving important people who arrived without warning. He stood, offered his hand, and opened his mouth to greet him. But Dante didn't shake his hand. He pulled out the chair across from him, sat down, and placed a sheet of paper on the desktop. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges and had a crease down the middle because it had been kept in a drawer for years. It was a copy of Wesley Carter's death certificate, clearly listing his name, date of birth, date of death, and cause: traffic accident on Route 6, Pennsylvania. Wesley looked at the paper. The polite smile on his face went out. Not slowly, but instantly, as if someone had pulled the plug from the socket. He didn't look up. He looked at the death certificate, and Dante watched him looking at it, and both of them knew that from this moment on, there was no game left to play. Dante spoke. He said there was a woman who had kept this paper for 3 years. She had believed it was real. She had held a funeral for the person named on this paper, had cried before the urn of ashes belonging to the person named on this paper, had worn the wedding ring of the person named on this paper around her neck every day for 3 years. But the person named on this paper was sitting in front of him. Wesley swallowed. He looked up, and what Dante saw in his eyes wasn't remorse, but fear. The fear he had lived with every night when he checked his phone before sleep. The fear he had forced down every morning when he walked into Halloran Capital under a name that didn't belong to him. That same fear was now standing in front of him, wearing a black wool coat and looking at him with eyes that didn't blink. Wesley tried to control his voice. He said Dante had the wrong person, that he was Weston Cartwright, born in Boston, and he didn't know any Wesley Carter. Dante didn't argue. He didn't need to. He only looked at Wesley for a few more seconds, long enough for the silence to become heavier than any words could be. Then he stood. He left the death certificate lying on the desk between 2 pens and a cup of coffee, still giving off steam. He said he was never wrong, and that Mr. Cartwright had 48 hours before this paper ended up on someone else's desk. Dante walked out of the office. He didn't look back. He didn't need to, because he knew the paper lying on that desk would do its work. Truth doesn't need a guard. It only needs to be placed in the right place. Behind the closed door, Wesley sat alone in his office, staring at the death certificate bearing his own name, and for the first time in 3 years, the fear he had tried to lock inside his chest finally found its way out. 48 hours later, Mara sat in a leather chair on the 40th floor of the Halloran Capitol building, in a room where she was certain she didn't belong. Arthur Halloran's private office was wrapped in oak and glass, but Mara didn't look around. She sat with her back straight, both hands resting on her lap, and beneath her right hand was the marriage certificate she had carried with her from Millbrook. She wore the old coat she had worn through the entire Greyhound bus ride, through the police station, through the alley beside Bryant Park, and that coat, in this room, looked like a stray object in a world that hadn't been made for it. Arthur Halloran sat behind the desk across from her. He was over 60, with silver hair, a straight back, and eyes that studied Mara with the cold curiosity of a man accustomed to measuring everything with data before allowing emotion to enter. He didn't know who she was yet. He only knew that Dante Ravelli, his largest business partner, had requested an urgent private meeting and had brought with him a woman he had never seen before. Dante sat in the chair beside Mara, though slightly behind her, as if he were giving the stage to what was about to unfold. He began without circling around the truth. He said that Mr. Halloran, his future son-in-law, was not the man he believed him to be. Arthur's expression didn't change. He looked at Dante, then at Mara, then back at Dante. He asked only one question. Did Dante have proof? Dante gave a slight nod, signaling to Sal, who stood beside the door. Sal walked to the desk, set down a tablet that was already open, then pressed play. The room fell silent, and from the small speaker came a voice Mara recognized instantly, though she hadn't heard it in 3 years. Wesley's voice, the voice she had heard over the phone during the final video call before the police called at 4 o'clock in the morning. He was about to graduate. Everything she had done hadn't been wasted. He was coming home. Wait for him. Arthur Halloran listened to the recording without moving. When the recording ended, Sal changed the screen to a split image. On the left was a copy of Wesley Carter's death certificate. On the right was Weston Cartwright's official personnel photograph from Halloran Capital's internal system. The same face, the same eyes, the same indentation on the bridge of the nose, only the name was different, the place of birth was different, the entire identity was different. Arthur looked at the 2 images, then he looked at Mara. This time he looked at her differently, no longer with cold curiosity, but with the gaze of a man beginning to understand that he had been deceived. He didn't ask Mara who she was. He looked down at the marriage certificate she was holding on her lap, and he read the names there without needing to pick it up. Mara Whitfield and Wesley Carter. Arthur Halloran was silent for nearly a minute. It was the heaviest silence Mara had ever witnessed. Heavier than the silence at the police station when they told her she was mistaken. Heavier than the silence in the church in Millbrook when she had stood alone before the urn of ashes. Because this silence did not belong to a man who didn't believe her. This was the silence of a man who was beginning to believe, and who was calculating the consequences of believing. Arthur straightened his back. He didn't rage, didn't slam the desk, didn't say a single sentence louder than his normal voice. He only reached to his right, pressed the intercom button on the desk, and said in the steady voice of a man who had made thousands of difficult decisions in his life, and for whom this was only one more, "Call Weston up here. And call my lawyer." The office door opened less than 5 minutes after Arthur pressed the intercom button. Wesley walked in with the confident stride he had practiced for 3 years, the stride of Weston Cartwright, Vice President of Strategy, future son-in-law of the most powerful family on Wall Street. But that stride froze the moment he saw the woman sitting in the leather chair on this side of the desk. Mara. Wesley's face went pale, not slowly, but instantly, as if someone had drained all the blood from his body in a single heartbeat. He looked at Mara, then at Dante, then at Arthur, then at the death certificate lying on the desk beside the tablet that was still displaying the 2 photographs side by side. And for about 3 seconds, everyone in the room saw the thing Wesley had tried to hide for 3 years. He knew. He knew who Mara was. He knew what that death certificate said, and he knew the game was over. But Wesley didn't deny it. He didn't say he didn't know this woman. He didn't call her unstable or mistaken. He didn't do any of the things an ordinary liar would do when cornered. He did something much worse. He admitted it. Wesley looked straight at Arthur Halloran, and his voice was so calm it was almost frightening. He said that he had been wrong, that there were decisions in his past he wasn't proud of, that he had made a serious mistake, and he was willing to take responsibility. But then he went on. He said that everything he had built for Halloran Capital over the past 3 years was real. Every deal, every strategy, every dollar of profit he had brought back to the company was the result of real ability, not the name printed on his records. He looked at Arthur with eyes that didn't tremble and said not to let a personal matter destroy $1 billion. Arthur Halloran listened to every word Wesley said. He didn't interrupt, didn't nod, didn't react at all while Wesley spoke. And when Wesley stopped, waiting for a response like a man accustomed to negotiation waiting for the other side to make an offer, Arthur did something Wesley likely hadn't expected. Arthur stayed silent. He stayed silent long enough for the quiet in the room to grow suffocating. Then he said slowly that Wesley had just given him his final answer. No anger, no raised voice. Only a simple statement from a man who had seen enough. Because Arthur Halloran didn't need any more proof. The death certificate, the recording, the 2 photographs, all of it was serious. But the thing that made him decide wasn't the evidence. It was Wesley's reaction when he was exposed. A normal person would have collapsed, apologized, cried, explained. Wesley negotiated. Even while standing before the wife he had abandoned, before the future father-in-law he had deceived, he was still weighing profit and loss. And that, to Arthur Halloran, was an answer clearer than any document. Arthur picked up the phone and called Celeste. Celeste Halloran stepped into her father's office 10 minutes later. She had hurried up from the charity foundation she was running downstairs, and when she crossed the doorway, she still didn't know why she had been called up. Arthur hadn't told her over the phone. He had only told her to come at once. Celeste saw Wesley standing in the corner, his face bloodless. She saw Dante sitting still in his chair. She saw Mara, a woman she had never met, wearing an old coat, sitting with her back straight, looking at her with eyes that held no hatred. Arthur explained everything to Celeste. He spoke briefly, truthfully, without adding or removing anything. Weston Cartwright was actually Wesley Carter. He had a wife. He had staged a false disappearance. The wife was sitting here. Arthur played the recording again for Celeste. Wesley's voice filled the room for the second time. He was coming home. Wait for him. Celeste listened, and she didn't cry. She stood very still for a long while, looking at Wesley, then at Mara. Then she spoke in a slow voice, one word at a time, as though she were laying each brick down to build a wall between herself and the man she had once loved. She said she had loved a man who didn't exist, and Mara had married a man who had buried himself alive to abandon her. That both of them, she and Mara, were victims of the same ghost. Celeste said nothing more. She turned, walked out of the room, and closed the door behind her without looking at Wesley again. Only 4 people remained in the room. Arthur had turned toward the window. Dante still sat motionless, both hands resting on the arms of his chair. Wesley stood in the corner, for the first time in his life unable to find a sentence to say. And Mara, the woman who had walked 4 kilometers to the hospital every morning, who had pawned her father's truck to a loan shark, who had cried before an empty urn of ashes, who had been sent away by the police, who had nearly boarded a bus back to Pennsylvania to forget everything. Mara rose from her chair. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't beg Wesley to explain. She stood straight and walked toward Wesley until she was less than 1 step away from him, close enough for him to smell the hospital antiseptic on the blouse she wore beneath her old coat. She looked directly into his eyes, and she said only one sentence. "You died to me a long time ago. Today I only came to bury you one last time." Then she turned, walked past Dante, past Sal standing by the door, out into the hallway, into the elevator, and left the 40th floor of the Halloran Capitol building. She didn't look back. She didn't need to look back, because she hadn't come here to ask Wesley to return. She had come to end it. Everything collapsed faster than Wesley had imagined. That very afternoon, Arthur Halloran turned over the entire file Dante had provided to Halloran Capital's legal team, and the lawyers forwarded it to the FBI within 24 hours. Detective Frank Marconi, the Pennsylvania state trooper who had handled the accident on Route 6 3 years earlier and had always carried a small suspicion he had never found the evidence to pursue, received the call from the FBI and reopened the investigation immediately. 2 weeks later, Wesley Carter, or Weston Cartwright, or whatever name he wanted to use, was arrested right inside the Halloran Capitol building on Madison Avenue, in front of the colleagues he had worked beside for 3 years, under an identity that didn't belong to him. The charges were staging a false disappearance, life insurance fraud with an accomplice, marriage fraud, and financial identity fraud. The insurance company employee who had helped Wesley alter the dental records was also arrested that same day in New Jersey. Halloran Capital issued a statement cutting all ties with Weston Cartwright and canceling his engagement to Celeste Halloran. The trial took place 4 months later in federal court in Manhattan. Mara went to the sentencing hearing straight from St. Vincent Hospital. She was still wearing her white blouse beneath her old coat, because she hadn't had time to go back to her rented room and change after her morning shift. She sat in the audience seats at the back, not in the witness row, not in the plaintiff's row. She didn't speak before the court. She didn't add any further accusations. She only sat there, both hands resting on her lap, her back straight, and looked forward. The sentence was handed down. 9 years in federal prison. Wesley stood and heard the sentence without any reaction, his face having lost all expression weeks before the trial began, as though the mask he had worn for 3 years had finally fallen away, and there was nothing left underneath. When the judge finished, 2 court officers stepped forward, cuffed Wesley's hands, and led him down the center aisle of the courtroom. Wesley walked with his eyes fixed straight ahead, and he would have passed the row where Mara was sitting without stopping, if his eyes hadn't accidentally flicked downward. He glanced at her chest, and he saw the silver chain. The chain he knew well because he had watched Mara wear it every day during the years they were together. Her mother's chain, and on that chain, resting at the center of her chest beneath the fabric of her white blouse, was the cheap silver wedding ring he had slipped off his own finger and placed in her hand at the Millbrook train station 5 years earlier. She was still wearing it. 3 years after he had died, after the funeral, after the urn of ashes, after 2 years of darkness, after everything he had done, she was still wearing his wedding ring around her neck, and that was when Wesley cried. Not because of 9 years in prison, not because his career had collapsed, not because of Celeste, or Arthur, or Dante, or anyone else in that courtroom. He cried because the cheap silver ring he had forgotten long ago was still lying against the chest of a woman he had tried to erase from his life. He cried because he saw, truly saw for the first time, the price Mara had paid, and that price rested inside a flaking silver ring hanging from the old silver chain of a mother who had passed away. Mara watched Wesley cry. She didn't turn her face away. She looked straight at him, and she saw tears running down the face of the man she had loved, had sustained, had buried, had mourned, and had carried against her chest for 3 years. Then she did something very slowly. She lifted her hand to the collar of her blouse and unfastened the first button, then the second. She slipped her fingers inside, took hold of the silver chain, and pulled it out. The silver ring gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights of the courtroom. She held the ring between the thumb and forefinger of her right hand, turned it lightly, then slid it off the chain. She fastened the chain back around her neck, her mother's chain, the chain that now felt lighter than before, because it had been relieved of something it had carried for far too long. Then she leaned forward and placed the jewelry on the back of the wooden bench in front of her, gently, as though setting a flower on a grave. She stood. She slung her backpack over her shoulder. She stepped out of the row, walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, and walked out the door. She didn't look back. The medal remained on the wooden bench. No one picked it up. No one in the courtroom knew that Dante Ravelli had been sitting in the very last row throughout the entire trial. He had arrived early, sat still, spoken to no one, watched everything unfold from the back, like a man watching a play whose ending he already knew, yet still needed to see with his own eyes to believe it had truly happened. When Wesley was led down the center aisle, Dante watched him until the courtroom door closed. Then he looked down at his left wrist. The Patek Philippe watch was there, the second hand still moving steadily, its crystal marked by a few faint scratches from 12 years of never leaving his wrist. He reached over with his right hand, unfastened the clasp, and took it off. He held the watch in his palm for a while, feeling its familiar weight one last time, then slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. When Dante stepped out of the courthouse and got into the car, Sal saw that his left wrist was bare. In the 12 years Sal had followed Dante, he had never once seen that wrist without the watch. Sal asked why he had taken it off. Dante looked out the car window, stayed silent for a few seconds, then said he didn't need it anymore. This case was over. His mother could be at peace. Sal didn't ask anything else. He started the car and drove away. 2 weeks after the trial, Halloran Capital's lawyer contacted Mara by phone. They said the corporation wanted to offer her financial compensation as the person directly affected by the fraudulent conduct of a Halloran employee. They named a figure Mara had never imagined she would hear in her life. Mara refused. She said she wouldn't sell her pain. She asked for only one thing. Halloran Capital had to publicly acknowledge its failure in the employee background check process, so no one else would be deceived the way she and Celeste had been. Arthur Halloran heard that request from the lawyer, and he agreed without negotiation. A few weeks later, a new scholarship fund was established. Though Mara didn't know who was behind it, the fund was named Constanza, created for single nurses who wanted to pursue advanced professional training. Mara received an envelope in the mail, and inside was an invitation asking her to serve as the fund's honorary advisor. The letter carried no sender's signature. In the upper left corner of the envelope, there was only a small embossed symbol, the image of the Ravelli family's signet ring. Mara looked at that symbol for a long time, and she understood. She didn't call, didn't send a thank you letter, didn't try to make contact. She simply signed the acceptance form and mailed it back. That was how two people spoke without needing to speak. Sal came to see Mara one Saturday afternoon. He gave her a key and a folded sheet of paper. The key belonged to a small studio apartment in Brooklyn Heights, owned by Ravelli Holdings. The paper was written in capital letters and unsigned. No one will ask for rent. Stay as long as needed. Mara held the key, looked at Sal, and asked whether she should accept it. Sal said that wasn't a question for him. Mara moved into the apartment the following week. The apartment was small, clean, with nothing beyond basic furniture. A month after she moved in, a small package arrived. Inside was a silver spool of sewing thread, the kind used by seamstresses in the old days, old and tarnished with time. Along with it was an unsigned card, saying this had belonged to a woman who had once sewn clothes to feed someone unworthy, and she would have wanted Mara to keep it. Mara placed the silver spool on the bookshelf in the living room, beside the leather-bound notebook. She didn't need anyone to explain who the spool had belonged to. 3 months later, a parcel was delivered to the Brooklyn apartment. The sender's name was Celeste Halloran. Inside was a hardbound manuscript, nearly 200 pages thick, the title printed on the cover. The women whose names were erased. Mara opened the first page. The dedication read, "To M.W., who taught me that truth doesn't need a microphone to be heard." Mara read that dedication twice. Then she closed the manuscript and placed it on the bookshelf beside the silver spool and the leather-bound notebook. 3 things from 3 different people. A notebook from her father, a spool of thread from the mother of a man she knew almost nothing about, a book from the woman she had never met face to face, but with whom she shared the same wound. 3 things standing side by side on the bookshelf. And Mara needed nothing more. 2 years later. St. Vincent Hospital, Millbrook, Pennsylvania. Mara stood in the small conference room beside the emergency department, wearing a white lab coat, her brown hair gathered neatly at the nape of her neck. In front of her, 6 trainee nurses sat listening as she taught them the organ transplant coordination process. She was no longer the night shift nurse. She no longer carried trays of food at the roadside diner off the highway. She no longer walked 4 kilometers to the hospital every morning. She was an organ transplant coordinator, the person who connected donors with patients waiting for one more chance to live. And every day she came to work, she helped preserve the very thing she had once nearly lost, someone else's hope. Around her neck, she still wore her mother's silver necklace. That necklace had followed her through Millbrook Station, through 3 jobs, through the funeral, through 2 years of darkness, through the alley near Bryant Park, through the Port Authority bus terminal, through Antonelli's restaurant, through the Halloran building, and through the courtroom. But there was no longer a ring on that necklace. It was only her mother's silver necklace, and that was enough. After the lecture, when the trainee nurses had left, Mara remained seated alone. She opened the leather-bound notebook lying on the table. It was a new notebook, brown-covered, bought 1 year earlier when her father's old notebook had run out of pages. The first page of the new notebook didn't contain her father's handwriting. The first page held her own words, written in a hand as close to her father's as she could manage. Mara, don't ever let anyone steal your name. She turned to the last written page and added one more line. Some people say justice never arrives on time, but maybe justice doesn't need to arrive on time. It only needs to arrive for the right person. She closed the notebook, set the pen down, and looked out the window. Outside, half a block from the hospital, a black Mercedes sat silently by the curb. Inside the car, Dante Ravelli sat in the back seat, his left wrist bare, no longer wearing the Patek Philippe watch he had worn for 12 years. He slowly turned the gold signet ring on the ring finger of his right hand, then signaled for Sal to drive away. He didn't get out of the car. He didn't call. He didn't need to. The Mercedes pulled away from the curb, joined the flow of traffic on the street, and disappeared at the end of the road. In the conference room, Mara didn't turn around. She smiled. That was the story of Mara Whitfield, a woman who lost everything because she believed in a promise, but found herself again because she refused to let the truth be buried. This story reminds us that sometimes life doesn't give back what has been taken from us, but it gives us the chance to rebuild from the truth of who we are, not from someone else's promise. If this story touched you, if there was any moment that made you pause and think about yourself or about someone in your life, please share it with us in the comments below, because we're always listening, and we cherish every feeling that comes from deep within your hearts. Please hit like and share this video so more people can hear the story. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please subscribe now so you won't miss the compelling stories we bring you every day. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.